Yes, hello to you all once again, and another very warm welcome back to your number one and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel, where of course we continue to take a look at more of those old school motocross race bikes from back in the day, and just try and discover what it was about these old vintage race bikes that made them so special for their time. Now, if you're a brand new subscriber to my channel, I do hope you will continue to enjoy future postings here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. And of course, if these are the kind of race bikes that you like looking at here on YouTube, then I do hope anybody that hasn't already subscribed to my channel maybe consider doing that very small thing in the future. So coming up next, we're going to take a look at a bike that enjoyed iconic status when it was first released in the late 1970s. Now, there were very few of these bikes actually made, and this particular example here is a very rare bike that has been fully restored. So without any further delay, let's jump into the video and take a look at this 1978 Hagon Yamaha Fourstroke twin shocker. Now, contrary to what many people think, that alloy-framed motocross bikes were invented by either Honda or Yamaha, because back in the 1960s, British manufacturers were already using alloy frames on their off-road bikes, and the likes of Greaves were using their I-beam alloy frames on their Challenger models around that time. And of course, in the late 1970s, the great Alf Hagen then came up with this beautifully sculpted monocoque alloy frame on his Hagon Yamahas that were of course built for legendary British rider Vic Eastwood. Now, our example here is one of those unique Hagon Yamahas, and this is a 1978 Mark II Vic Eastwood Hagon bike, and this machine here has been fully restored by legendary classic bike builder Rod Spry. Now, the great Alf Hagen was a speedway and grass track rider in the early 1960s, and Alf was also very well known for building all kinds of bikes in his tiny garden shed at his home, and he also took part in motorcycle sprint races. And it's said that Alf was one of the very first riders to record a sub 10-second run, doing a time of 9.93 while he was riding his Jap-powered supercharged V-twin 1260cc dragster. Now, also in 1968, Alf became the very first British rider to complete a flying mile run at RAF Honington, when he clocked a speed of 206 miles per hour. But after Alf retired from racing, he then bought over the Girling Suspension Company in 1985, including of course all of their stock and design drawings. But he didn't continue with the Girling name on his new company, and he simply called it Hagen, who even in this modern day still produce very high quality suspension systems for all manner of off-road and road-going motorcycles. But Alf Hagen was also a very talented motorcycle designer, and he was renowned for making his motorcycle chassis as light as possible. And when he came up with this quite radical alloy monocoque chassis in the late 1970s, it's probably pretty fair to say that the motocross world had never seen anything like it up until that time. Now, this lovely looking alloy monocoque chassis really started out as just a pet project for one of Hagen's employees back in the late 70s, and his name was Terry Rowing, and it was Terry who had the original idea to build a full-blown motocross bike frame from sheet aluminium, and the first of these Hagen creations was completed in 1977. Now, of course, the entire concept of these Hagen frames was to try and keep the chassis as light as possible, and hence the reason for choosing alloy as opposed to maybe heavier, stronger steel. But essentially the main body part of the chassis is just one single piece of monocoque construction with reinforcing plates on either side of the bike just to help to secure the Yamaha motor in its place. Now, the other parts of the chassis where the frame had plates bolted onto it, again, it was lighter alloy bolts and nuts that were used to fix them all together. And if it was an important critical part of the frame's construction, then steel fasteners were used, although these would then be drilled to remove as much excess metal as possible to further reduce the all-up weight of the bike. Now again, one of the more intriguing factors with regards to these Hagen chassis is that at first glance, this fuel tank certainly looks like it's just another part that's been bolted onto the chassis, where in actual fact the fuel tank is part of the chassis construction, where it just helps to add rigidity and strength to the frame. And this part of the bike is also so well made, it's quite hard to distinguish it from a conventional tank and chassis combination. But it's superbly made and extremely clever in its design. And Terry Rowing and Alf Hagen certainly knew what they were doing back in 1977. With regards to the power plants for these Hagens, now these were supplied by the well-proven and reliable XT or TT 500 Yamaha four-stroke engines, which back in the late 1970s would have been fitted to the old TT Yamaha trail bikes at that time. Of course, in its standard stock trim, this motor wouldn't have been much use for motocross racing, but once you'd fitted bigger valves and fitted higher lift race cams and maybe did a bit of porting and tuning, you could then turn this basically mundane four-stroke motor into a full-blown fire-breathing monster. And almost certainly our featured motor here has undergone the aforementioned upgrades, although the actual mods that have been done on this Vic Eastwood Mark II bike were never really disclosed to me at the time I grabbed these video clips. Although you can just imagine how well suited this big four-banger Yamaha motor was bolted into that featherlight alloy Hagen frame, and this bike had a great combination of light frame and powerful motor, which were two of the number one priorities that you required when designing an off-road race bike. And again, you can see that some of the cooling fins on the cylinder have been removed on this upgraded Yamaha engine, but these motors have a very good reputation for their ruggedness and reliability, and that's one of the reasons that they were used on many other off-road bikes across the globe. Now again, the fuel for the big Yamaha motor is supplied here by a relatively modern style Mikuni carburetor, which was probably chosen for its ability to adjust and tune it to suit the parameters of its motor and its rider. And again, as you can see, a good set of alloy footrests which have been fixed directly onto those strong aluminium bracing plates on either side of the frame. Now, another very nice piece of engineering again on this Hagen Yamaha was this rear brake pedal, which was mounted onto the bike's front of the chassis rather than the conventional way of fixing it to the rear of the frame as they do on most other motocrossers. And this again was cable operated with a quite lengthy cable that had to run from the front of the chassis to the rear. But again, another bit of nice engineering by the bike's designer Terry Rowing and Alf Hagen. Now moving on to the bike's rear swing arm, which is another bespoke item that was designed by the Hagen engineers, and again, as usual, crafted in that precious weight-saving aluminium. Of course, it would have been easy enough to just design and build a swing arm from steel for this bike, but of course the entire bike building project was all about weight saving, and this light but very strong alloy swing arm was just another component in this very unique and ground breaking motorcycle. Now, as we move to the bike's front end, we have a pair of American-made Steve Simons forks, who was a well-respected engineer of 1970s motorcycle suspension systems in that era. And in fact, Steve Simons then went on to develop and pioneer the new style upside-down motocross forks that became so popular in the 1980s. But for their day, these Simons forks were pretty good by all accounts, and although they were hugely popular in their native USA, they weren't so well known or readily available here in the UK. But legendary American racer Brad Lackey at one time stated that these Simons suspension systems were said to have played a significant part in him winning the 500 World Motocross Championship in 1982 while he was riding a Suzuki. So that's certainly a decent endorsement and compliment to these Simons suspension systems. Now again, as you'd expect, the front and rear hubs on our Hagen machine came straight from the Yamaha YZ two-stroke bikes. And this front hub here is, as you can see, the twin leading shoe variety. But for their time, these old school drum brakes on these Hagen bikes were pretty good by all accounts, and they were certainly good stoppers for the late 1970s. But of course, these older drum brakes may have had to work that little bit harder to slow down this bigger, heavier Yamaha Fourstroke motor, as opposed, of course, to their lighter two-stroke machines that these brakes would have been fitted to originally. Now, as we move on to the bike's rear suspension, and these, of course, were a pair of Fox air shocks that back in the late 1970s were considered as state-of-the-art suspension systems, and they were widely used on many other different makes and models of motorcycles. But once again, these air suspension units were pioneered by Bob Fox in 1974, although the success of these air shock units really took off when rider Kent Howerton won the AMA 500 championship while he was riding a Husqvarna that was fitted with these suspension units. And soon after, it seemed that every motocross racer in the country then just had to have these radical air suspension systems fitted on their race bikes. But there was plenty scope for adjusting these shocks' angles and ride height at the back, as this Hagen chassis with these three different mounting positions was put in there to allow for changes in track conditions and rider preferences, although without doubt having those quite decent Simons forks on the front and these Fox air shocks on the rear, they both certainly complemented that superb Hagen alloy frame and that big Yamaha motor. Now, naturally, you just can't take any kind of motocross seat and then fit it onto this custom-made alloy frame, so a brand new bespoke seat had to then be constructed around the alloy monocoque chassis, and this again had an alloy base and a foam insert, and of course it was finished off with this Vic Eastwood Hagen logo situated at the rear. And again, because this is a fully restored Hagon Yamaha, the bike's plastics have also been replaced with these period correct parts from the late 1970s era. And because these Hagons are of course super rare, original 1978 plastic parts are almost impossible to source nowadays, although these replacement parts certainly still do justice to this beautiful looking machine. Now, most of the bike's controls are again very good quality items, as you'd expect from such a unique machine as this, with a good pair of Renthal handlebars and Magura alloy brake and clutch levers fitted. Now, the bike's gasser throttle is a Swedish-made alloy-bodied Gunnar gasser, and the grips there are all manufactured by Scott. Now, because our particular Hagon Yamaha here is powered by that big TT500 four-stroke engine, a decompressor lever has also been added to enable the motor to be kicked into life by, of course, reducing the compression in the cylinder. Now, it's quite well documented that there were only 50 of these Hagon Yamahas ever made, and our featured bike here is the Mark II version, which was built in 1978. That was a year after the very first prototype left the factory in 77. But in terms of their overall looks and design, there's certainly no other off-road motocrosser like it on the planet, although Hagon didn't just build this Yamaha version of their monocoque alloy frame bike. They also made another interpretation of this motorcycle using this Suzuki four-stroke motor, and in this clip here you can see one of these Suzuki Hagons that I captured at the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show in 2020. But there was even less of these Suzuki bikes built, and it's said that just one or two were actually put together, and these Suzuki versions were based on the old SP370 four-stroke motor, which was then bored out to 450cc to enable it to compete against the big 500s. Although in terms of their rarity, these Hagon Suzukis are super rare, and it was certainly a scoop for me on the day just to capture some footage of this almost unheard of Hagon machine. Although as we go back to our featured Hagon Yamaha here, we've not even scratched the surface of the list of great achievements that the great Alf Hagen has had during his career as a motorcycle racer and of course bike builder, and we've certainly not really got the time to list them all in this very short video. But it's still suffice to say that Alf Hagen and of course the great Terry Rowing, who had the initial idea to build this project, were certainly years ahead of the rest of us when it came to designing and building these kind of groundbreaking machines. And naturally it makes you stop and think about where the world would be without the likes of Alf Hagen and his fantastic contributions to world motorcycling. Well, there you go. I do hope you enjoyed that walk around that very rare 1978 Hagon Yamaha Fourstroker, another one of the superb race machines from the Rob Hughes classic dirt bike collection. But as I said, a very rare bike, and you don't see many of these Hagon Yamahas even in museums these days, let alone see any on the racetrack. And of course those Suzuki versions of the Hagon bikes were even rarer than the Yamaha versions, due of course to the very small numbers of Suzuki models that were actually made. Okay, so coming up next on my channel, we're going to take a look at this quite nice looking Evolution Kawasaki 250. Now this lovely bike belongs to Scottish rider Kenny Hope, and we'll be taking a look at Kenny's lovely Kawasaki when we return to my next video posting here on my channel. But until then, of course, everybody out there, continue to be safe and well, and watch out what you're doing when you're riding those old vintage dirt bikes, and we'll all get back here together again very soon to talk about more vintage iron right here on your favourite and #1 classic dirt bike TV channel.